Good evening, everyone. Good evening to everyone joining us today. My name is Naqiya Shiraz.
I am Vimanga.
And welcome to the fourth episode of AdvoChats.
Ladies and gentlemen, we warmly welcome you to AdvoChats. AdvoChats is Advocata's curated discussion where we discuss current economics and conversations that are in the national arena. This being said, we encourage you to take part in these conversations. Send us your questions, your queries on whatever that you think happens in the current economic environment. Ladies and gentlemen, you can send in these questions on our Facebook as well as YouTube, as well as in YouTube, and we will be taking all these questions during the course of this discussion.
Thank you, Vimanga. Joining us in today's discussion is Dr. Roshan Perera. She's a senior research fellow of the Advocata Institute. She has over 20 years of experience in formulating and implementing monetary policy and fiscal policy at the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. During her term at the Central Bank, she held multiple senior management positions, including deputy director. Additionally, Dr. Perera has been a consultant to various institutions, such as the Institute of Policy Studies, the World Bank, and UNDP. Welcome, Dr. Roshan.
Thank you very much, Naki and Vimanga, for inviting me to AdvoChats.
Doctor, to kind of start off today's discussion on how can the budget 2020 facilitate growth, can I pose, I'm going to pose this initial introductory question to you, and this is regarding the Framework for Economic Recovery report that you authored along with the Advocata team, Doctor. So the report centered around on the broad macroeconomic policy areas and how to tackle the instability within it. If you can explain to us and our audience listening in today why such issues need to be addressed, and more importantly, why is it important for the long-term sustainability of growth for the country?
Okay, thank you, Nakia. That's a good point to start at. Basically, I think first thing we need to try to come to terms with is what is finally the objective of economic policy. What are we actually trying to do through all these policy measures that we're advocating? I think the fundamental the objective is really to improve the welfare of people and to give everybody a better standard of living. And in order to do that, basically we need to have an economy that is robust, which is healthy. But how do you know that an economy is healthy, and how do you sort of identify that? So there are certain parameters that are used in economics to try and understand where an economy is, because you need to have a benchmark so that you know how far away you may be from the benchmark in order to be able to propose or to try to take any policy actions in order to correct it if you're away from this steady state or stable equilibrium that you're trying to get to. So one thing is basically you want the economy to be growing at some kind of steady or sustainable rate, and at a rate at which inflation should be also low and stable, so that it doesn't have a material bearing on the decision making of economic agents. And secondly, the economy should be also resilient to shocks, either internal shocks that we might be faced with, or even external shocks like this pandemic, or even in the global financial crisis. So economy should be resilient. So those are the two kind of what you're trying to achieve through your economic policies. And in order to do that, basically what you're trying to do is to create this balance, both your internal balance in your internal accounts, that is to have growth, the economy producing goods and services, optimizing the utilization of all the resources in the economy, so that it's neither generating inflation or deflation. And also, but sometimes you may not be able to produce all the goods and services you need, so you might have to import something, you might have to get something from abroad. But even when you're doing that, you're able to finance those imports of goods or services without affecting the economy too much, or without having too much of an impact on your borrowings. You're not really stressing the economy in terms of your external borrowings, or you're not having too much of a impact on your exchange rate. So those are kind of the measures that you would use to see that's what you're trying to achieve in terms of the economy. Because what happens if there is too much demand in the economy, or there's excess demand in the economy, it will lead to inflationary pressures, and the impacts of inflation on particularly on the most vulnerable groups, and even in the decision making of producers and consumers. So that's kind of where you're trying to keep your economy, and it is in that situation that you really generate the best outcomes for the majority of citizens in your country. So I think that's what you're trying to achieve in terms of your economic policies.
Dr. Roshan, if I was just to follow up on what Naqiya said, and also reflecting the economic recovery roadmap that you were part of, something that has been said numerous times is this question of the twin deficits. And Dr. Roshan, I believe the report makes a claim that the question of twin deficits are responsible for most of Sri Lanka's economic woes. Dr. Roshan, for the benefit of our general audience, how would you like to elaborate this concept and simply explain the consequences of the twin deficit?
Thank you, Vimanga. So that is very much related to our whole thing of this internal balance and external balance. Because when you talk of twin deficits, basically what you are referring to is first your deficit in the internal accounts, which is your deficit in your fiscal sector, or your budget deficit. We commonly call it the budget deficit. And the other deficit is basically the deficit in your external account, which we measure through the current account deficit in our balance of payments. So basically, those are the deficits we are referring to. And when we talk of internal and external balance, that's what we're trying to achieve, right? So we're trying to keep a balance really in all these different accounts. But what is important to understand is that these deficits are also linked, because the external current, the deficit in our external current account is really the sum of the deficits in our private savings, the savings between the difference between the private savings and investments of the private sector, and our government savings, which is basically the difference between government revenue and government expenditure. So the important thing to understand is that if a government or country is running a deficit in the external current account deficit, we need to understand what is driving this deficit really. Is it due to a deficit in the private savings investment gap, or is it because of the private savings investment gap? Or is it because of government's dissaving, or because the government is spending more than it's earning? Because if it's due to the private savings investment gap, it may not be such a bad thing, because that shortfall between our private savings and private investment is often financed through foreign investments or FDI. And in that case, basically what is happening is we are getting foreign funds into the country, we are getting technology, we are getting expertise, and we are actually expanding the productive capacity of the economy, and thereby increasing our future growth potential. So that may not be such a bad thing. On the other hand, if our current account deficit is due to government spending, or where the government is spending more than it is earning, this then would have to be financed through borrowings. And the more and more we have to borrow, it has obviously other implications. I mean, a country is no different to a household. You cannot borrow indefinitely, right? There will come a day of reckoning. At some point, you will, as an individual or a household, you will not be able to service your debt. Or you may be able to service your debt, but you will have to service it at a higher rate. Right? And you can't keep, or on the other hand, you might be able to service your debt, but you won't have the income to buy the necessities, basically your food, your clothing, or you won't be able to pay for your education needs or health needs, because you're spending all your money trying to service this debt. And at some point, your creditors probably will stop lending to you, right? If they feel that you're not able to pay beyond a certain amount, certain if you don't have that capacity to lend to repay, they'll probably to stop lending, or even if they lend to you, you might have to pay very high rates. And this is where these money lenders and the guinea poly comes in, is when you can't, when you have lost your credit worthiness with a bank, you have to go to a money lender or a guinea poly and you end up having to borrow and pay much higher rates. And actually that worsens the situation, right? Because now you're having to pay even higher amounts of debt service payments in order to make ends meet. So what is true for a household is also true for a country. So in that sense, if you look at the case of Sri Lanka, we have had a very long experience with these twin deficits. So I'll stop there, but I hope the viewers understand, or your audience understands, what these twin deficits mean and how they are interrelated, really.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan, for that very in-depth explanation. And again, to our audience listening in, if you do have any questions, please send them in. Doctor, to kind of expand on your explanation that you just kind of gave us, in your experience, how would you say that this long-term historical trend of twin deficits, like you put it, what would you say the other longer-term impacts that'll have for a country in terms of its growth prospects and sectoral growth, for instance?
Yes, so just continuing, I guess, from how I explained it, Sri Lanka, the problem with Sri Lanka is we've had a long history. I mean, in our entire post-independence period, we have basically been running deficits in both our fiscal sector and the external sector. And this has led to high borrowings, both from the domestic market, but also from external sources. So the problem with the domestic market is because the government is taking whatever resources, and there's always a finite amount of resources, right, in any economy. Because the government starts absorbing all these resources in the domestic market, it crowds out whatever resources that are available for the private sector, and because we run out of those, and then we have to rely on external sources, it has ended up with us having very unsustainable levels of foreign debt. So although in the short term, I think there is an argument that we need high government spending because it will stimulate growth, as we have seen periodically in the case of Sri Lanka, and particularly in the post-war period. What happens in the medium to long term is it actually acts as a drag on growth, because it has an impact on the key variables of the interest rate and the exchange rate. And let me explain that a little bit more. Because when a government borrows continuously from the domestic market, what happens? It basically crowds out, as I said, it crowds out resources from the private sector. And when you have, the whole demand and supply effects, when you have more demand for resources, obviously the price for those resources goes up, which is the interest rate. And the higher the interest rate goes, basically it becomes unviable for a firm to borrow, because the cost of borrowing sometimes is higher than the return it can earn from its investments. And then that basically reduces investments in the private sector. And similarly, on the exchange rate front, when a country has a large external debt, the tendency is for the country to try to stabilize the exchange rate because of its impact on the debt stock. But then what happens? You get a misaligned exchange rate, because you have an exchange rate which is not aligned with the fundamentals, and it ends up favoring imports and activities in the non-tradable sector, because imports become cheaper, and you're basically encouraging activity in the non-tradable sector. But that again has a knock-on effect because it further aggravates the external sector because you are basically doing a disservice to your exports. Whereas for a small country like Sri Lanka, with a small market in terms of size and income, we really need to have exports for growth, for employment and job creation. So there again, we are actually affecting the long-term growth prospects of the country because we're running these deficits. So this is why it's so important to stabilize for macroeconomic stability to be there in order to have long-term prosperity and long-term growth in an economy.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan, for that, I would say, extremely elaborate answer. Dr. Roshan, if we were to shift gears a bit, and especially as we're heading towards the budget period, let me ask you directly, what's your outlook for budget 2022?
Okay, so let me sort of rephrase that and say, okay, what would I hope that they would address through the budget 2022 really. So I think all this time we've been talking about the macroeconomic situation. So I think primarily, and then these two deficits, right? The fiscal deficit and the external deficit. So I think for macroeconomic stability, those are critical. We need to address on the budget, through the budget, they need to address particularly the fiscal deficit because that is within the purview of the Minister of Finance or the Treasury. And why? Because, as I said, that has spillover effects into the other sectors of the economy, and particularly the key variables, that is interest rates and the exchange rate. So there, I think we really need to address our tax system. We need to, put that right. We need to address our spending patterns. We need to have sort of some kind of medium-term fiscal framework because we need to instill confidence and credibility in the system that we're at least putting these things right. Because it's only then that we can instill confidence in investors, not only both domestically and external investors. So I think that's the first thing I would hope that would be addressed through the budget. And second, of course, we need to have policies to stimulate economic growth and improve competitiveness, right? And I hope, and these would be some kind of long-term structural reform. I mean, this might be things that need to be done over the medium to long term, but at least we need to start putting those policies in place so that the necessary reforms are undertaken to address some of the bottlenecks, some of the weaknesses in the economy, and the things that are preventing investments from coming into the country, or even locally from being made in the country. So I hope we will be able to put in some policies that would address that. And thirdly, I think particularly when you look at what has happened through the pandemic, the lack of fiscal space that the government had in terms of addressing the vulnerable populations, the people who were affected most through the pandemic. I hope that we will start building some buffers, at least start. I know it's not going to be, we can't do it in 1 year or one budget, but at least we'll start the process where we will start building the buffers, because we are going to be buffeted by other shocks. This is not going to be the last shock that we're going to experience. So we need to have those buffers to be able to cushion the economy, both for households, but even for firms. And we need to build those safety nets. So I hope that those three areas would be addressed through this budget.
Thank you for that, Dr. Roshan. Regarding the earlier question, we've gotten a question from the audience. I'm just going to read that out to you now. And it says, Considering that the agricultural economy is a crucial part of our whole economic system, how much of the effects in the organic fertilizer only policy are how likely are they to affect the budget and the economy? And kind of like a follow-up to that, he asks, will it lead to bigger deficits, more inflation, shortages, etc.?
So I have to first say that I'm not an agricultural economist, but I'll just talk in terms of, I mean, demand and supply, basically. I think we need to be very careful when we implement policies, without, we need to really study them. We need to study the impacts of these policies, and we need to implement them in a cautious and gradual way. And I think this applies also to this whole issue of organic fertilizer. I think we need to have more thought and more study, really. And I think there are experts in this area who have studied this issue before we go, wholesale and implement a policy like that. And I think particularly looking at what is happening in the global markets, I think we really need to be very cautious about the impacts that these policies might have on particularly our food production and food security, because we're seeing shortages, price rises in many of the staples across across the world, actually. And so we don't want to add to it by creating our own. Domestically, we shouldn't be creating shortages through our own policies, when we will anybody, because these are things that are happening internationally due to international shortages. So the price of I think wheat and corn, and I mean there are so many other commodities which have been affected due to increasing demand and various other issues. So I think we should be very cautious at this point that we deal with our domestic agriculture in a very cautious way, so that we at least have our buffers that will help us with our staples, so that we can put in whatever additional resources we'll need to be able to afford to even import whatever other commodities we need from outside. So I think that's something that I would say, but I have to say that I mean I don't have a technical answer on this, but that's what I would say in terms of dealing with this issue.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan. Ladies and gentlemen, we're open for questions, so please keep posting your questions, and we will take them up as they start appearing. Dr. Roshan, digging a bit deeper onto the question of the budget, what do you think, according to your prognosis, should be the focus of Budget 2022? In terms of policy priority, should this budget be about growth, or should this budget be about macroeconomic stability, or should it be about managing the present economic crisis? What do you think should be the focus, the priority of this budget?
So I think firstly, I think macroeconomic stability is key. Without macroeconomic stability, we really can't even, as I explained from the beginning, you really need macroeconomic stability even for growth, for long-term or sustainable growth. You need macroeconomic stability. So I think that should be the priority. How can Sri Lanka re-establish macroeconomic stability? And for the budget particularly, because the budget is really focused on fiscal policy, I think there really needs to be a focused look on how to improve the fiscal sector. So you have to have a deep dive and look into your tax policies, Where have you, where are the areas, because you don't want to stifle growth, right? You don't want to also, whatever the little growth that is going on, you don't want to have a negative impact on that. But there are definitely areas where you can tap your tax revenue, or you can raise tax revenue. Um, that you need to improve your tax administration, um, you need to improve your tax collection. So I think, and plus you need to have a better, be prioritized in terms of your spending. What are you spending on? Because there again, uh, the spending, you need to, maybe you need to cut your spending in order to be able to match your revenue, but also you need to spend on things that would generate future growth. So and future long-term growth. So you need to build your capacities, you need to build your human capital, you need to build your infrastructure, which will have higher returns. So I think those are the things that really the budget needs to focus on, and be very intentional in terms of what it is spending on and how it is going to raise its revenue. Because I think uh, I think the whole focus of a budget, or the budget, really should be to facilitate the private sector. Really, you should facilitate the private sector, while, as I said earlier, you need to build. You need to also protect the vulnerable households and businesses. So I think those are the two areas. If you are able to devise or design your policies in such a way that you're able to achieve those two, I think that would be that should be the focus of budget 2022.
Thank you for that, Dr. Roshan. Dr. Roshan, we have a question that's coming in, and it's very similar to what you just said, but I'll read it out, and if you think that you would like to add anything else, please do. And the audience member asks, and he's regarding the fiscal deficit. He wants to know if you have any suggestions on increasing government income and reducing spending. I know you mentioned a few of those things in your earlier question. Is there anything else that you would like to kind of add to that?
Yes, so I think looking at government revenue, I think there are several areas that you can tap in terms of bringing in things into the tax base. I think if you look at the last tax changes that were made, you can see in terms of the tax thresholds that were increased, the tax rates that were reduced. I think all those are things that need to be re-looked at, because we've seen that, I mean, the tax, particularly if you look at the income tax threshold, it's much higher than, proportionately much higher than most countries would have as an income tax threshold in terms of our per capita GDP, per capita income, sorry. So that's one area that you can address. The tax rates, the tax structures. Sri Lanka has one of the lowest tax rate structures compared to many countries in terms of income taxes or VAT rates. So I think that's another area that we can definitely look at. The other thing is, basically, we need to also look at our tax incentive structure. I think Sri Lanka has a very generous tax incentives, and we don't have any sunset clauses. I mean, many of these companies, once they get the tax incentive, it goes on, indefinitely almost, even while after they've started making profits. So I think these are some areas that we really need to look at carefully, because these have long-term implications for our revenue generation. And I don't want to say the numbers here, but I mean, basically what has happened is you'll find that GDP has, GDP is growing, and the areas where, national income is growing has changed over time. But you find that the tax base itself, or the areas that are taxed, have stagnated or actually regressed over this period. So there really needs to be a real careful look at our tax base, and there are many areas I think we can tap to improve tax revenue collection without having a negative impact on growth going forward.
Thank you, Doctor. I hope that answers the question. We've just to kind of summarize what we've spoken about so far for any of the members joining in now. The discussion will be available if you've missed the beginning on our social media pages after it is over. But so far, what we've talked about with Dr. Roshan is we've kind of looked at the importance of macroeconomic stability for the growth of a country, in terms of inflation needing to be stable, and how the economy needs to be resilient to external shocks if it wants to be if he wants to see growth in the long term. We also covered we also discussed the twin deficit phenomenon. There has been a kind of a historical trend that we've seen in Sri Lanka. So this looks at the budget deficit and the external current account deficits that we see. And we also look at the effects that these deficits can have for the long-term growth prospects of countries. Vimanga, is there anything else that you would like to add to kind of summarize what we've talked about so far?
No, I think, Naqiya, you've wonderfully summed up everything. I think just on mine, I believe Dr. Roshan spoke on food shortages, especially when the question on agricultural policy was raised. And I think another important thing that she highlighted was that the budget should be focused on facilitating the private sector when we were discussing policy priorities for the proposed budget.
Thank you, Vimanga. Dr. Roshan, kind of veer away from the topic of the budget that we've been discussing so far. I'd like to ask you about the central bank roadmap that was the 6-month roadmap that was published a few weeks ago. Can you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on this roadmap that was spoken about?
Yes, sure. So just for the benefit of the audience, just to remind you, so basically central bank, the focus or the core objectives of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka is basically economic and price stability and financial system stability. And the main tool that the central bank has to ensure these objectives, or particularly economic and price stability, is basically the interest rate. Really, the important thing is that the central bank should have the independence of using that tool to achieve its objectives. So given that, I would say that I didn't see a lot of a lot of clarity in terms of how the central bank was going to use that tool to ensure, this economic and price stability, because they talk about the fact that, there is macroeconomic instability, there are vulnerabilities in the economy. The thing is that, yes, thereafter we have seen interest rates, slowly adjusting up. So we can see them using the interest rate instrument, but I did actually see that in the roadmap. What I found from the roadmap is I saw that there were, a lot of policies, proposals of, policies that were proposed to address various issues. But my question was there enough analysis that was done to understand, how effective those policies would be to address those issues? What was the link, and has that been done? Because otherwise what can happen is you'll have these policies, but then they may not really translate into you might not see the effects really. And the other point that I want to say is, so interest rates is basically a price. So you let the market basically determine the supply and demand by, or based on this price. The issue I see is that there's a lot of interference, or we're trying to put a lot of regulations and give various directions and directives to the market in how to operate in different markets. And the experience has been, I think, not only in Sri Lanka but in most parts of the world, is this interference in markets does not end well. Ultimately, what happens is there has to be some adjustments have to be made, and the adjustment becomes much larger than what might have been necessary if there was, the market was allowed to gradually adjust, as well as the cost to the consumer or producer ends up being much higher. So what I would say is, I think again here the central bank needs to be a facilitator, needs to facilitate the markets to operate, facilitate the private sector to operate. So I would have liked to see something like that in the roadmap. And I know this is only for 6 months, and there's also indication that there'll be a roadmap, another one in January. So maybe we might see something, we'd like to see something maybe more on those lines in the next roadmap.
Dr. Roshan, I mean, taking up probably a different subject altogether. There's a lot of curiosity on the government's decision in removing price controls. Dr. Roshan, how do you see this phenomenon? And I think there are lots of questions also on inflation. So what role will inflation targeting play here? Dr. Roshan, would you be able to just elaborate on these for the benefit of our audience?
So again, I'll just go back to sort of the history of inflation targeting. I think what happened was, particularly because of the experience that countries had with very high inflation in the 70s as a result of the oil shocks and various supply constraints in the 70s and 80s, central banks started they refocused, and they felt that their primary focus should be on maintaining inflation or at a very low and stable level, because of the impacts that inflation had, the negative impact actually that high inflation had on growth in those periods. So this led to a renewed focus on central banks on keeping inflation low and stable. So I think in that context, I think inflation targeting is something that, if you look across central banks around the world, they're very focused on their inflation target, or keeping inflation. So some have an explicit target, and they'll say, we want to maintain inflation at such a rate over a medium term. Some don't have an explicit target, like the Federal Reserve of the United States. They don't have an explicit target, but still, that they are very much they're focused on maintaining inflation at a particular rate. In Sri Lanka, this has also been, we talked about this for a long time, of having an inflation targeting central bank, and I think even recently there was the revisions to the Monetary Law Act was in terms of having some kind of inflation target, sort of flexible inflation target. The issue is that to have an inflation target, the central bank needs to have independence in terms of their objective of maintaining inflation and of their tool, which I said was the interest rate. So without that, it will be very difficult for a central bank to credibly target inflation. So that is one thing. The second one is, I think you talked about this whole price controls. That's the other thing. I mean, if a country or a government keeps having price controls, it will be very difficult for a central bank to credibly control inflation, because when those price controls are removed, it's not because of demand side pressures or because of monetary policy or interest rates or monetary policy issues that prices will increase, but rather due to other factors, because of administrative price changes. But I think that is something that we need to move towards, because in most countries that have actually gone towards, at least explicit or implicit price, stable prices, you've seen that they've had much more stable growth rates and much more stable macroeconomic conditions. So I think there is a role, and I definitely think that central bank needs to keep its focus on that. But you cannot do that if you have fiscal dominance, and if you're asked to, finance the deficit periodically. It's not going to be possible for a central bank to credibly defend their, not defend, but be able to maintain interest rate, inflation by using their interest rate as a tool.
Thank you, Doctor. To kind of broaden the kind of question that we asked earlier, you mentioned a lot about how other countries kind of look at their policies in terms of their contexts. And so far in today's discussion, we've highlighted the domestic issues within our domestic context, Doctor. But in terms of looking at the global context and the issues that are faced abroad, how would you say that these global issues influence the Sri Lankan economy? I know you mentioned this in an earlier question as well in regard to food shortages and how international food price increases are affecting Sri Lanka as well. But is there anything else that you would like to add?
Yes, so I think during the pandemic, you had most economies, including Sri Lanka, doing a lot of quantitative easing, or putting a lot of, particularly the central banks, put in a lot of money into their economies to try and stimulate the economy, or to try to bridge the gap between the aggregate demand, which was falling from the consumers and other sectors, and to kind of stabilize the demand in the economy. Now with the recovery, and it's kind of a recovery that is taking place across much of the world, there is an indication that these economies might start unwinding the positions in terms of the the quantitative easing, and also the low interest rate regimes that they have been following for much of this, since the pandemic. Now that would have a very direct impact on countries like Sri Lanka, which have borrowed externally, because our interest rates are obviously determined, or a function of the interest rates that operate in the global market. So if those interest rates go up, it means that our borrowing costs will go up even further. And given that we have quite a large external debt, that will have direct implications for us. Secondly, in terms of the global food shortages and particularly fuel prices, I would say that is going to also have would have a big impact on us, because, and we are already seeing that, because energy prices are now currently higher than what they were even pre-pandemic. So we would have to import at costs are obviously going to go up in terms of our import costs. So our imports are going to start increasing, and if we don't have enough exports and external other inflows, non-debt creating inflows, it's going to have worsen our trade balance. And I think we've kind of seen that in the first 7-8 months of this year, where the trade balance had widened, and much of it was due to increases in our intermediate goods like fuel and other commodities as well.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan. Ladies and gentlemen, just a gentle reminder, we are still open for questions. as we run to the latter part of the discussion. So please keep sending us your questions, and we will take them up. Dr. Roshan, I think we've one of our priorities is to talk of economic reforms. Looking at the budget and the post-budget period, would you say that fiscal consolidation is the need of the hour? And if so, what tools do we have on that front and if we were also looking at it as a structural reform, how can fiscal consolidation be implemented?
Yes, so I think there fiscal consolidation, as I mentioned, one is through the government's direct fiscal policy. So basically, they are ensuring the tax reforms, but also in terms of spending. And I think that I didn't really go into too much of detail. So I think one is spending prioritization. We find that we spend a large amount on recurrent expenditure, on salaries and wages, on pensions. Now, we need to really take a very long and hard look at that and see whether that is really going to increase the productive capacity of the country. I mean, is that having a positive impact on growth? So that's something that needs to be looked at. So we need to have some kind of rationalization of the public sector. The other one is that I'll focus on in terms of reforms is, I think, in terms of the state-owned enterprises, and what kind of reforms do we need to have in that area. The other one is on and there I think we need to look at the subsidies and transfers that we make to these state-owned enterprises. So I think that's something that we really need to look at. And I think in terms of fiscal consolidation, I think we need to have sort of a more rules-based approach. It can't be discretionary spending. You can't just spend unlimited and just keep going to parliament and getting a supplementary estimate and spending as much as you want, because you can just go to parliament and increase your spending limits. I think there needs to be some kind of controls in terms of, I think we've talked about this, like things like fiscal rules. We need to have fiscal rules, but they need to be enforceable, or there needs to be some kind of mechanism by which, if you breach those limits, there is some kind of penalty. And so those are some things that need to come in, and we need to have some kind of independent monitoring. And there, I think that's where the citizenry of this country it's very important. That I know everybody is sort of waiting for this budget, and you're glued to the TV or the radio trying to see what goes on in the budget. But it's usually to see what can I get, or what am I getting from the budget. And then after that, you kind of forget about the budget until the next 12 months and the next budget. But I think it's up to us as the citizens of this country to keep following up on the promises or whatever has been made in the budget, and keep the governments responsible or accountable to whatever is being spent. Because after all, if they are spending, it's based on your tax, whatever is being raised through your taxes, right? So there needs to be some kind of accountability, and that accountability really needs to come from us or the citizens themselves. So I think that is something that I would encourage, particularly all young people here who might be listening. I think that is a role that you really need to play in terms of holding your government accountable in terms of their spending.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan. I think you brought up some really strong points there. And to kind of get a little bit more clarity on what you were saying, around the issue of public finance management and public sector reforms, would you be able to kind of elaborate on a few of these and describe the kind of impact it can have to the task of helping Sri Lanka emerge from the present crisis?
Yes, so I'll just take sort of one example. I think we talked about this, and Vimanga also mentioned it, and you're talking about this sort of public finance reform or kind of spending reform. And basically, we have to understand is that there is nothing called a free lunch, right? So if you are subsidizing some activity or a business or consumption of a good, basically that someone else has to pay for it or is paying for it. So if you take a SOE for an example, say CPC, if the government decides to provide fuel at below market prices, basically the loss has to be borne by the owner, who is the government. Right? In this case, it's the government because the government is a sole owner of the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. And finally, what we find is that these losses need to be financed, and they're financed through the owner or the institution borrowing. And in this case, if it's the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, majority of its financing is through the domestic banking system, right? And that has implications for the rest of the economy, because as soon as these public enterprises, so it's not only the government borrowing from the domestic banking system, it's all these loss-making entities are also borrowing from the domestic banking system. So what is remaining for the private sector, then that the domestic resources become less and less, which means that for the private sector to borrow, they have less resources, and also the cost of their borrowing increases. And again, what I said earlier, it becomes unviable for a private sector or individual, if you are trying to start a business, to borrow from the banking sector, because it's not cost effective. The return you get from your investment is not going to cover the cost of your borrowing. The next is basically, it is also an inefficient way of transferring resources. So if you're trying to subsidize, the very poor, that's not what you're doing. Finally, what you're doing is you're subsidizing the entire, all those who are consuming that product, right? So if you have, say, if you're talking about the fuel subsidy, you're basically subsidizing not only, the rich and the poor, everyone alike, because they all consume the good. And in fact, studies have shown that actually through these subsidies, you're actually benefiting the rich, or the subsidies are actually biased against the poor, because they consume less of that good than even the rich. So these are some reasons why we need to have this public sector reform. And the other one is often because it is not a cost reflective price, right? You're basically underpricing it. It could also lead to even overconsumption. You're going to have people, because it's cheap, you just buy more of that product. But if it is at a priced at a correct level, you would be more conscious about how you consume that product, right? So those are some things that and then finally, of course, I would like to say, by shifting your resources to subsidize certain sectors of the economy, you're basically, you don't have enough funds to finance the sort of essential services that the majority of our people need, like education or health or transport. And I think that came very much to the fore in this pandemic, right? Because we didn't have sufficient funds to put to these areas, to the health sector, to education, to go online, or do to equip the health sector to address or to be able to kind of be agile enough to address the issues that came about as a result of trying to do online learning and online teaching. So for all these things, I think it is very important to have good public finance management, to see where you want to allocate your resources, where is it that you're going to get the highest return, what is going to have the highest impact in terms of growth and stability going forward. So I think for all those reasons, I think public finance management is important and needs to be done in a very consciously, looking at all these issues.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan. Dr. Roshan, we have received quite a number of questions on SOEs. So I'll try to summarize this under under the bigger umbrella, and I'll phrase this question in such a way that it sounds like Dr. Roshan, what is the relationship between liberalization and economic growth? And if you add SOE reform into that equation, what is the output improvement that we are going to get?
So I think here, again, it's to do with the allocation of resources. If you are pricing your products right, and if you are not having to subsidize, or where the government has, you're subsidizing areas without really good understanding of what needs to be subsidized or what needs to be given priority, then you're going to end up misallocating resources. So I think in terms of economic liberalization and economic growth, I think the experience has been to facilitate, as I kept saying, private sector activity, because the private sector basically works on prices, right? On the incentives, on the right incentive, bringing the right incentive structure. If you have right incentives, the private sector will basically choose the kind of activities that need to, will undertake the activities that will give the highest return in terms of economic returns. And of course, sometimes you might find that there might be some people who may not benefit from those returns, and that's where I think you need to also look at the helping, having those safety nets, so that you address the the most vulnerable of the population. But I think you have to allow the economy to function based on market principles. But as I said that, I will also say that you have to also then have some kind of safety nets in terms of direct transfer. So provide a direct transfer to those who might be most affected by that, rather than providing subsidies which will be ineffective, which will be inefficient in terms of allocating resources, and you're going to waste resources by having a subsidy type. You're trying to pick winners, and you're trying to give subsidy to some sectors and not the others, and the governments very often don't know which activities are the most productive, or the most beneficial for our economy. So you should let the market operate, allow the market and the private sector to determine that. But just as you do that, you also need to be mindful of some segments of the population that may become vulnerable to that, because of the market-based operations, and you need to provide a safety net to address that.
Thank you for that.
I hope that answered the question.
Yes, Dr. Roshan, definitely.
Dr. Roshan, to kind of, I think we are nearing almost the end of today's discussion. So to kind of almost end with like a summary of what we've been talking about. And especially as a nation, we've been stagnating between short periods of high levels of growth and long periods of low levels of growth. And Dr. Roshan, you mentioned and extensively spoke about this phenomenon during the discussion, and the reasons as to why this has also been occurring. So what are the structural reforms that you think the country needs to achieve to be sustainable and to kind of promote inclusive growth?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to sort of repeat myself, but I think what we need to do is to introduce policies that would really improve the productivity of the factors of productivity of the factors, really, because that very often, I mean, what we've seen over time is we have very short spurts of high growth, and then we go back into a slump. And so it's kind of, you're almost like giving a sugar high, and then you go into a slump, and then again you kind of give a sugar high and a slump. But what you need to, like a diabetic, you need to keep someone stable. Their sugar levels need to be stable, and to do that, basically what you need is you need to have policies that would improve people's ability, or the country's ability to achieve some kind of stable growth. and that requires improvements in our productivity, really, and competitiveness, because we need to be competitive both domestically and internationally. And why internationally? Because we are a small economy. We need to be able to trade in order to, because our markets are small, we need to be able to trade internationally. And I think there are several reforms I think we have also proposed in our framework for economic recovery. I mean, basically, we need to improve our business environment. It needs to be such that investors are willing to put their money here, particularly foreign investment. We need to be able to attract foreign investment, and to do that, we need to have a very competitive business environment. Right at the moment, I think there are many studies that have been done that there are so many barriers to entry, regulatory barriers, so many things that investors face when they try to do business in the country. So I think those are some things that we need to address. One of the things, of course, is actually the access to land. I think that has been identified as one of the top barriers to investment. I think that needs to be addressed. The government is the largest owner of land, so there needs to be a system by which this land can be allocated for good investments. But then those investments need to be identified. There needs to be a proper analysis of what these investments are, and the price too. And again, I think the market mechanism needs to work there. The other one is the labor market. I think Sri Lanka being a small economy, I think our labor has to be our main resource, because we don't have a lot of other natural resources. We need to improve that resource in terms of the skills, in terms of bringing more people into the labor market. So we have a lot of the feeble labor force participation has been very low for decades. How do we bring them in? I mean, we've been talking about these things forever, but I think with an aging population and us no longer being able to rely on a demographic dividend, I think it is imperative, or it's becoming more and more urgent, that we address some of these issues. Otherwise, even when the economy takes off, we don't want to have bottlenecks in terms of the labor. We need to have that labor, and we need to have that labor that is skilled, with skills that are relevant for the future jobs that are going to be created. So the education system needs to address that. We need to be job ready. I mean, at the moment, if you look at the unemployment rate, the highest unemployment is among youth, and many of these youth are educated youth. So that says something about the education system, or what we are educating our youth. So those are some things that we need to address. And the other one, of course, is we still have infrastructure that needs to be built. We need to be very mindful of what type of infrastructure we're building. I mean, there has to be a very careful analysis of where the priorities are, and the infrastructure that we build must be such that it gives us the highest social and economic returns. So there needs to be good evaluation, good monitoring, and careful analysis in terms of where we put our money, because again, we are fiscal constrained, so we can't just spend our money anywhere. We have to be very mindful about where we're spending money and get the biggest bang out of our buck. So I think that's what I would say in conclusion.
Naqiya, do we have time for one more question? I believe there's an interesting question on the chat. Can I take it up?
Sure, Vimanga, go ahead.
Dr. Roshan, I think someone from the audience wants to know, can you name any kind of sector category that the 2022 budget should, I would say, prioritize in order to boost the economy without burdening the deficit? Would you like to answer this question?
So as I said, I think it's very difficult for us sitting here. I'm not a business person. I don't know what the, you know, what the where the highest returns are. So even as a even a technocrat, I think it's very difficult for someone to say, okay, this is where the highest return is. We're going to put money here, or we're going to give you the incentive. I think that's where we need to have uh, create the environment for businesses to come in, for people to do business freely or with the least amount of hindrance. And I think in that situation, the market itself will determine what are the major areas, and because businesses are going to are going to invest where they're going to earn the highest return, or where the country will earn the highest return. So I think the budget really should facilitate this environment, and allow the private sector or the businesses to make those decisions. I don't think it's up to either the policymaker or a researcher to say, pick this or pick that, but rather I think the role of the policymaker is really to create that environment.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan. Naqiya, how are we in for time? Do you should we conclude now, or do you think?
Sure. Dr. Roshan, if I could just ask you one more question from the chat box. I think we did touch on it earlier as well, but it's a very direct question, and it reads, wouldn't the cost of living increase when price controls are removed?
Yes, definitely. I mean, in the sense that it depends on what share, of course, that those commodities have in anybody's food basket. But if they are key commodities, yes, they would. And that is where I think I made the comment earlier that we must not. These must be gradual adjustments, so people can adjust to it gradually. When you suppress something or a price for too long and then you suddenly let it go, the adjustment is much harder, and the cost to the consumer is also much greater. So I think that's where we make the mistake. If it is a gradual adjustment, people can, adjust to it gradually. But secondly, what I have to say is that yes, there'll be many people who will be affected, and that's where we need to have those buffers or the safety nets to address those who will get the most affected by these price increases. So I think I would say that yes, we need to be mindful of the impact of price increases on households, and we need to address them through some kind of a safety net system.
Do we have any more questions, or are we open for concluding remarks?
I think we have addressed most of them throughout the conversation, Vimanga. If there's any other questions, please add now to the chat box. But otherwise, I think we're good.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan. You've provided an extremely elaborate analysis on a lot of these issues that is presently facing the economy. What would your concluding thoughts be, and what do you have to tell our audience, especially regarding outlook and policy? You've spoken so much, but what would your concluding thoughts be?
So I think in terms of policy, I hope that the policies that we implement would be to facilitate the private sector, let businesses operate, but also be mindful of the most vulnerable in society. So you have to build those safety nets into the system. In terms of us as the public, as the audience here and the public, I think our responsibility is to make sure that that we keep the policymakers and the governments accountable to ensure that the way they are spending the money that they earn through taxes and other means are spent in the most responsible way, in the way that benefits society as a whole and the country as a whole. So I think that is the message that I would like to leave the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a wonderful evening, but unfortunately, we've come to the conclusion and end of the discussion. So we would like to leave you with a few thoughts. Advocata is planning on having a series of AdvoChats. So please stay tuned, send in your questions for future sessions, and join us in this quest to understand and implement policies that bring prosperity to Sri Lanka. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining today's session. And stay tuned. You can follow us on our social media pages, and a recording of this conversation will be available on YouTube and all our social media platforms. Dr. Roshan, thank you very much for taking part, and you've provided a lot of insight to most of us. And thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Vimanga.
Audience.